You are listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Ancient tools and burials, plants and seeds, Neanderthals. All these things we make no apology are the study of archaeology. But we don't do dinosaurs, no we don't do dinosaurs. Ranger trials as one will call.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Archaeological Fantasies Podcast, episode 30. I'm your host, Sarah, with my co-host, Ken Fader. And today we're discussing folklore, mythology, and oral histories. We're going to look at how they are interpreted by modern people to fit into their ideologies. And we're going to look at how they're used in actual archaeology, in interpretation of sites and the histories of the cultures that we study. Get ready to think critically.
Funny bitty blokes you will see are a staple of archaeology. But we don't do dinosaurs, no we don't do dinosaurs, no we don't do dinosaurs.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to the podcast. I'm here with Ken. How are you doing?
I'm great, Sarah. How are you?
I'm doing great. I just bought a new car, so everything's wonderful.
There you go. Do you have to stop eating now for like a couple of years while you pay it off?
Oh, no. This is being covered by the insurance company of the guy that totaled my last car, so
how
it costs me nothing.
Very convenient.
Yeah, well, joke's on them. I had to replace that car anyway.
Yeah, there you go. Sarah, people are listening to this podcast. You're going to get in trouble.
No, they paid me what the car was worth. I mean, it's worth what it was worth.
Cool.
Anyway, today we are going to discuss oral histories and mythology, how they're used in popular media, especially shows that support alternative history concepts. And then we're going to explain how they're actually used within the field of archaeology. So, my pet peeve, because this is basically a soapbox episode, my pet peeve is when shows specifically like Ancient Aliens or authors like Eric von Daniken misinterpret a mythology or an oral history and say, you know, here's some funny pictures that I don't understand by a culture that I don't know anything about. Therefore, it supports my theory of aliens.
Right, sure. There, so much of that is a problem of context. Is that
it really
if you pull out, say, a piece of art, or you pull out a story that's told over generations, you pull it away from its cultural context, you can make it sound like practically anything. And it's important. Right. I mean, it's like we've talked about this a little bit before, the Palenque sarcophagus lid. If you don't know anything at all about Maya mythology and Maya, origin stories, or the concept of a Maya heaven, you take that, if you strip it from its cultural context, you can convince yourself, oh my God, from my 21st century perspective, that looks like a guy in a spaceship. But that is not the way folklore should be interpreted or how it should be used in attempting to figure out what the past was really like.
No, folklore and oral histories and cultural mythologies are very important, actually, to the field of archaeology. They give us a lot of clues, sometimes actual physical clues, right. and sometimes they're just a way for us to understand the group of people that we're studying. Right. And we should always rely to those first before we start making our own assumptions onto objects, because especially when it comes to interpreting archaeological artifacts, sometimes we don't know what we're looking at, but when you show it to a culture, someone from that culture, they're like, oh, that's X. Because they immediately know what it is.
Exactly. So I've got, just if I can give you just a very brief story of one of these bits of folklore that I encountered. Folks who listen to the podcast know that I've been working on this 50 sites project and book. And in fact, we devoted one of the podcast episodes to a couple of those sites. It was Mesa Verde and Horseshoe Canyon. Well, in those 50 sites, I also saw a place up in Washington State, right on the border of Washington and Oregon, along the Columbia River. And it's an amazing set of pieces of rock art. And rock art's one of those things where, archaeologists really have to rely on the stories, the oral histories and oral traditions told by the people alive today whose ancestors produced that rock art. And that's
Correct.
very helpful. And there's this wonderful, it's a lovely story. And forgive me for getting into my storyteller mode. But in any event, the first of all, the rock art, it's around a place called Horse Thief Lake, which is an artificial lake. This was the Columbia River, which has been dammed up along the river in several places to produce electricity, hydroelectric projects. And I think it was the 1950s, they were putting this dam across the Columbia. And there were a whole bunch of pieces of rock art that were going to be inundated by the rising waters of the impounded lake. And I know a lot of folks listening to the podcast probably are aware of the fact that when they did this along the Nile in Egypt, and that when they built the Aswan Dam, they actually moved Abu Simbel, which is a very, very well-known, famous, amazing, monumentally scaled set of carvings of Ramses and other figures. They actually moved the entire, and this is many, many thousands of tons. They cut them up into pieces and moved them to be up above the floodwaters of the river. Well, they kind of did that along the Columbia River with a lot of the rock art. They actually had guys with jackhammers come in, and I know this is not the best solution, but they jackhammered out a bunch of rock art. And you can go and see these things. They've been placed along an artificial petroglyph trail. These things are, yes, they are bereft of their context. They've been removed from their original locations, but at least the rock art has been salvaged.
Well, were they documented before they were moved,
yeah,
though?
There was photographic documentation, and it was pretty well documented. So the art itself...
So it's not a total loss,
right,
then.
exactly. But the cool thing is, some of the most significant and impressive of the rock art was high up enough on this cliff wall that it was allowed to... It could remain in place. It was not inundated. And one of these in particular is... just an absolutely gorgeous piece of rock art. If you're familiar with the art of the Northwest Coast, the Kwakiutl Indians and other tribes in the Northwest, the guys who built the totem poles, this piece of rock art doesn't look anything like the stuff you see in the Southwest or in the Far West. It looks like Northwest Coast Indian art. So there's this beautiful image. And now archaeologists look at this, and it's gorgeous. It's like 3 feet across, and it's got these gigantic eyes and these pointed up ears. And as an archaeologist, I look at that and I go, I have no idea. What's that about? It's beautiful. It looks like a kind of a combination of an animal and a human. And what's the point of it? Well, here's the story that the native people in the 20th century told of this piece of rock art that probably is 500 years old. They say their village, and we know that their village was located just downslope from where this rock art is located, and the village is now completely inundated by the waters of the rising lake. And the story they tell is that many, many years ago, there was a chief, and it's a woman. She's a woman chief, and she was very great and very wise, and she was getting older. And she was very concerned about what would happen when she died, who could take her place. And so she was having trouble sleeping, and she would walk the cliff above the village to see, to look over her people and consider what was going to happen when she passed away. And during one of these excursions, she was approached by Coyote. And in many Native American cultures, Coyote is viewed as a trickster. He's a guy, he's not an evil guy, but he's a guy who you can't really trust. And we're talking about a coyote who can talk, can speak human language. And so while she's walking along this cliff, Coyote approaches her, and Coyote says, "Chief, what seems to be your trouble? Why are you walking this cliff? Why can't you sleep?" And she turns to Coyote and says, "Well, Coyote, I love my people, I love my village, but I am very concerned. I can't be the chief forever. Someday I'm going to die, and who's going to take my place, and who can watch over my people?" And Coyote, who's always thinking about tricks, says to the chief, "Well, I think I can solve this for you." Now, of course, she's very suspicious about Coyote. And so what can you do? And Coyote says, "Well, I can make it possible for you to watch over your village forever." And she says to Coyote, "What do you mean I can be immortal?" And Coyote kind of avoids the answer, you can watch over your village forever. Now, here's the deal. Coyote thinks he's playing a trick on her. She is actually playing a trick on Coyote. She knows what she wants Coyote to do. So Coyote says to her, if you agree, I will make it possible for you to watch over your people forever. And she says, okay, I agree. Coyote says, close your eyes. And then Coyote kills her. But as she dies, he harvests her spirit and then fuses her spirit to the rock overlooking the village. And says to her as he's laughing, well, now you'll be able to watch over your village forever. And he walks away. The next day, that morning, the people wake up in the village. They say, where's our chief? And they can't find her, but somebody looks at the cliff above the village and says, there's a face. There's a face overlooking the village. And they all run up and they see this amazing face etched into the rock. And they say, that's the spirit of our chief. She's there and she'll be there forever. They give her a name, Sagaglalal, which in their language means she who watches. And now they say, now at least we know that in the spirit world, she will always be watching over our village. Now that's an incredibly moving. I've been there, I've seen it. It's an amazing piece of rock art, but it's made all the more amazing by the story told by the descendants of the people who actually made that rock art. Now, it gives was there really a woman chief? Maybe. Was there really a woman chief who was walking the hills there concerned about what was going to happen when she died? Maybe. Was there a woman chief who walked over the hills and Coyote approached her with this deal? I don't know about that. But nevertheless, doesn't that piece of folklore give us a unique perspective on how the people who actually produced that art, the descendants of those people, how they viewed, what they viewed as the significance of that piece of art? It's not just art for art's sake. It's an image of a well-respected and powerful chief who now will forever watch over our village. I mean, ultimately, the irony there, of course, is that, well, now what she's watching over is a big fat lake that destroyed the remnants of her village. So it didn't work ultimately into the 20th century. But it's a really cool piece of folklore. And archaeologists shouldn't ignore that or belittle that. That's a really important perspective, providing the context by the internal context, the context of the folks who made the art, how they viewed that piece of art. And that's extremely important from an archaeological perspective.
It is, and it's a really important. I mean, it's a really great example of what we're talking about, because I've looked up some pictures of it. And
isn't she beautiful? I mean, she really is gorgeous.
Well, I think if we're looking at the same thing, it kind of looks like a raccoon.
You know, it's because it's got the pointy ears, right?
It's got the little, like, kind of, or maybe it's a bear because it's got like little bear. Well, at least that's how I would interpret it. But I'm not like we're saying, I'm not these people.
Right. And that's a super important point. When the people who produce the art say, this is our story, that's a completely different thing than somebody from a different society, different culture looks and says, you know, I think that's a spaceman, or I think that's a giant, or I think that's any one of a number of, that's Bigfoot. That really, that kind of context, I don't think moves forward the conversation at all. And that's really what we're talking about. You know, when the Maya tell us that's Pakal, he's poised between life and death. I take that a lot more seriously as an important perspective, more so than somebody, you know, a Swiss author saying, well, no, it looks like a spaceman.
Well, and doesn't the Pakal coffin, isn't the story, I mean, there's words, the petroglyphs around it are describing the scene.
Right. Well, what's going on in the case of Pakal, it's the Pakal context is incredibly cool. Pakal, his father was not the king or chief of the city of Palenque. He did not inherit his kingship through his father, which is what was supposed to have happened. What happens is he actually inherited it through his mother. And this gave the Maya kind of a problem because that's not the way it's supposed to happen. You're supposed to inherit the kingship from your mother. There was no male in the family line who could ascend to the throne. So what happens is the Maya kind of after the fact say that the mother, Pakal's mother, her name was Lady Beastie is the translation of her name. They say that she was actually a goddess. She wasn't actually a human being. She actually was a goddess. And so what they do on the Maya, in burying Pakal, he ascended to the throne when he was like, I don't know, 9 or 10 years old. His mother was the power behind the throne. She was the de facto ruler until he reached, I think when he was 40, she died. And there's actually some Maya art showing Lady Beastie handing Pakal the crown of kingship for the city of Palenque. And what it says around the edge of that is it's like a justification or rationalization for why Pakal deserved to be the king. So it's like a genealogy showing, well, wait a minute, okay, his father wasn't the king, but Lady Beastie was related to this guy, and ultimately part of that bloodline was godly, and so it's almost like a justification for why Pakal got to be the king. And so, yeah, I mean, it's really obvious. It has nothing whatsoever to do with guys from outer space coming down. It has nothing whatsoever to do with rocket ships. The Maya themselves are explaining why this guy was king and why he is now poised to go to heaven.
Right.
And the thing is, though, as we're saying, we get that context by reading what the Maya said about Pakal and Pakal's mother. We don't get any useful context by kind of looking at it with our head tilted one way and our eyes, one eye closed, and saying, well, you know what? You know what it looks like to me? It looks like a rocket ship. That's not the way you do science. You don't do
No, because it's not up to, I mean, it's up to us to give it meaning in that we're interpreting it. It's not up to us to assign the original meaning to it.
Right. In other words, listen, I'm not going to say, well, so therefore, because the Maya said that Lady Beastie was in fact had godly blood or was somehow not a human being, but in fact a god spirit. I'm not saying that's true. I'm saying that this is what the Maya said about Pakal and Lady Beastie, and it's all about his legitimacy ascending to the throne, and why his son, therefore, would be the logical person to become the king after his death. So,
right.
But that's meaningful and a reasonable thing to wonder about and to analyze. But again, it's so much of this is about people who don't know anything about the culture, who cannot interpret these things within the context of the culture that produced it. It's just not really helpful for somebody in the 20th or 21st century to say, based on what I know, this is how I'm going to interpret something that somebody produced in AD 650.
Let's chew over Pakal a little bit more, because we have mentioned him in previous episodes, kind of as a throwaway comment about, ancient aliens and that kind of interpretation. But for a greater, to make it a deeper topic, we should discuss why we know the imagery. I mean, yeah, there's the story around it explaining who Pakal was, and more importantly, who his mother is, and why this line of descent is valid for the kingdom, for kingship. But more importantly, the image itself is a very complicated image. It's really pretty too. If you've never seen it, I'm linking it so you guys can all go look at Wikipedia. But I mean, well, let's take Von Daniken's. Yeah, we got a couple minutes here before the first break, so let's take Von Daniken's argument apart. That he looks at this image and he sees an astronaut inside a spaceship, and he's flipping some switches, and there's I don't know, he's got all kinds of crazy things that he sees in the clouds here. But the way it's been interpreted by archaeologists who are familiar with the Mayan culture is that this is a great king. He's on his deathbed, and his soul is ascending into heaven. Right. And one of the main reasons that we know that we can confidently translate this image this way is not just because we've talked with, the Mayans are still around, by the way, but we've also got other images that can back this image up.
Right, exactly.
So we have other things as references
Right.
that help us
I
interpret
mean,
this image.
it is fair. It is more than fair to say that the image on on Pakal sarcophagus lid is unique as a whole, as a piece of art.
Yes,
You won't see anything else like that in all of the Maya art. However,
probably.
if you pick it apart, every one of the images that are on the individual images that together make the whole scene, every one of them you will see in other pieces of art thoroughly comprehensible. So, for example, if you look at the sarcophagus lid, there very clearly is a cross or a cross-shaped device, which is kind of behind Pakal. So there's if you look at the way Pakal is along the long axis of the lid, there's a long stake that runs almost the length of it, and then 3/4 of the way up, there's a cross piece. So it looks like a Christian cross. However,
Yeah.
we do know
Roughly,
from other
yes.
pieces of art, Maya art, that's their symbolic representation of a tree called the ceiba tree, which in fact the Maya believed they really are real trees, and they're really, really tall and skinny, and they hold up heaven. So those trees, now, obviously, if you don't know that, this weird figure in the back of Pakal sarcophagus doesn't make any sense. But if you recognize Maya iconography and you recognize what the Maya presented in other works of art and what they said about it, you know, okay, well, that's the ceiba tree. So that makes sense. There's Pakal, his soul suspended between the underworld and the Maya version of heaven, and that heaven is supported by this kind of mystical, symbolic tree that's holding up to heaven. The other thing that's kind of cool is that at the very top of the rocket ship that Van Gogh talks about, there's an image of a bird. It's a Quetzal bird. The Quetzal bird is symbolic of Maya heaven. So clearly, the spirit of Pakal, which is he's on his way to heaven, he's ascending the ceiba tree up to heaven, and waiting for them there in heaven is the symbol of heaven, the Quetzal bird. Now, again, this is not stuff that archaeologists have looked at or Mayanists have looked at this sarcophagus lid and made up a story. It's based on things the Maya themselves said, based on, in terms of what they've written, based on the stories told in the few Maya books that still exist, like the Popol Vuh, based on other sites with similar iconography. So this is all part of a piece where when you look at it within that context and knowing something about Maya iconography and Maya ideology, it all makes sense internally and doesn't require it does not allow for an outsider who knows none of that to say, yeah, but it looks like a rocket to me. Here's my issue about the Pakal sarcophagus lid, and this is true of a lot of the stuff that Van Daniken talks about and that Giorgio Tsoukalos talks about, and that is, and I've had this argument with people where I say, look, if I were to show you a photograph of the Palenque sarcophagus lid, and if you didn't know anything about what Van Daniken said, if you didn't know anything about what ancient aliens have said, and all I asked you was, what does it look like to you? Sarah, I got to believe that out of 1,000 people, I don't think one person would say, well, that looks like a guy in a rocket ship. It really doesn't. But then if somebody says, if somebody primes you to say, I think that looks like a rocket ship, well, then you start saying, okay. And, you know, if you have to be primed, if somebody has to tell you it looks like a rocket ship before you see the rocket ship, ain't no rocket ship.
You know, I've been primed to see it, and I know that I'm skeptical, and I've blah blah blah, but this thing's never looked like a rocket ship.
It really doesn't.
No, it really doesn't.
And for example, one of the things that Van Daniken says is that on the guy's head there are these tubes, and he considers them to be breathing tubes, which is, it's really kind of odd when you think about it, because the guy Pakal himself, the guy portrayed on the sarcophagus lid looks like a human being. So I'm not sure why he needs breathing tubes. And he also says that he's got things sticking out of this headdress that he considers to be like antennas. That's always bothered me. We are now at a point with cell phone technology where I got an iPhone. I don't have an antenna. You would think that
Yeah.
people who can traverse the universe would have more sophisticated technologies for communication. They wouldn't need antennas. But my favorite, and maybe I mentioned this before on the podcast, is that Van Daniken actually says, if you look at, I think it's the left foot of Pakal, he says it appears to be on a pedal, some kind of a control of the rocket ship.
Really, yeah, no.
But here's the thing. Wait a minute, a pedal? Is that the clutch? Is this a manual transmission rocket ship? It's not.
Well, yeah, it must be, because he says his hands are also supposed to be flipping switches, like he's steering or something.
But do you see? And I think at some point Van Daniken also says he appears to be looking through some telescopic device.
Oh yeah, that's what it's supposed to be. Yeah.
Do you see that? And then he talks even about the.
I mean, it is as if you like say the eyepiece is attached to his nose, maybe.
And in fact, what most Mayanists, among the kinds of jewelry that the Maya wore, they wore nose plugs and bones in their nose and their ears. And every Mayanist who looks at the Palenque sarcophagus and says, based on what that looks like, and in other scenes from other pieces of art, it's some kind of a nose plug. It's some kind of a piece of jewelry. It sure as hell doesn't look like a telescope or any kind of sighting device. And he even talks, Van Daniken even talks about the fact that he's wearing some kind of a skin-tight spacesuit. And again, it's like, actually, he looks like he's wearing a little bit of a skirt, and it doesn't look like he's wearing a top at all. So, but the bottom line here is, I think that anybody who is fair and looks at that image does not see a guy in a rocket ship. It's from the perspective of somebody who's not a Mayanist and not a Maya, and is not familiar with the art, not familiar with the iconography, and not familiar with the ideology. I will grant you, it might look really strange. It looks different because it doesn't look like something that's typical in Western art. But that doesn't mean that doesn't mean that it's legitimate to simply look at it and make up a story that's based on kind of and it's not even 21st century rocketry. It's more like kind of mid 20th century guys with pedals and bizarre tubes coming out of their heads.
I think my biggest problem with not just Pakal's sarcophagus, but a lot of European, basically a bunch of white guy interpretation of Native American mythology and stuff, is that they're totally, especially when it comes to images, because there's very rarely writing as we recognize it associated with like petroglyphs and that kind of stuff. But so people will just look at the image and reinterpret it as they need it to be interpreted to further their own opinions.
Sure.
What I dislike about it is it completely disregards any cultural context put there by the people who originally created it. And it just completely ignores any kind of anything except what you're trying to push forward as your personal opinion. Like, you haven't even done the research, even just cursory research, you know?
But here's something that I think as archaeologists we need to admit. Archaeologists have not always been really good at doing that either. So that for many Native Americans, for a very long time, and I think that that's dissipating now, there's been this belief that, you know what, archaeologists think that they own our story. They come in, they dig, they tell their story. They think that we have nothing to contribute to that. And archaeologists have been guilty of that. Of being the outsiders looking at these people like under a microscope and saying, we don't care about what you say, we're going to use this scientific approach. And the deal is archaeologists we continue to need to do a better job, and I think we are doing a better job of saying, well, listen, if we're going to look at rock art, we need to understand the context and the perspective of the people for whom this is part of their culture.
Right.
And that doesn't mean, and we can talk about this later on, when Vine Deloria, who was a very well-known Native American activist and a lawyer who wrote a bunch of books and who was very much opposed to the work of, I think, of a lot of archaeologists, and disputed what I think are now indisputable facts, and did this from the perspective of, hey, I'm a Native American, and your science stories, that's all bullshit, made up stories. Our folklore trumps that. That's another issue that we can talk about, and that's still very controversial and very impactful. But I think it's fair to say that archaeologists have, for too long, ignored the thoughts and the stories of the people who were in fact responsible for, whose ancestors were responsible for the sites and artwork that we study.
Yeah. We will continue that as soon as we get back from break.
The CRM Archaeology podcast brings together a panel of cultural resource management professionals to discuss the issues that really matter to the profession. Find out about networking strategies, job hunting, graduate programs, and much more. We'll often feature interviews with college professors, CRM business owners, and experts as well. Check out the show on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, and at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/CRM Arc Podcast. Let's get back to the show.
To the teachers, assistants, and support staff who see potential in every child, Grand Canyon University recognizes you. We created the National Center for Teacher Preparation at GCU, along with a generous scholarship, so you can become a licensed teacher with paid benefits. Over 100 GCU alumni have been recognized award recipients, including Superintendent, Administrator, and Teacher of the Year. Find your purpose at Grand Canyon University. Private, Christian, affordable. Visit gcu.edu/parapro.
And we are back, and I want to change gears just a little bit because oral histories do not necessarily have to be prehistoric. We have a long-standing tradition, at least in America, and I'm sure other places, of American folklore.
Right.
Things like Babe the Blue Ox, Paul Bunyan, Johnny Appleseed, stories that I was always familiar of them when I was a kid. I'm not sure if kids still get told these stories because we got told them at day camp.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if kids do day camp so much anymore.
I think kids these days get their folklore from cable.
Yeah, which is interesting because, a lot of folklore, it started off, some people say all of the folklore starts off with a real story and then goes from there, which is what makes it a quote-unquote tall tale.
Right.
I don't necessarily believe that there's always a grain of truth in it because taking Johnny Appleseed, for example, we were always taught, Johnny Appleseed, he was this really go-lucky guy. He liked to eat a bunch of apples, and then he would plant the seeds wherever he went. And that's why there's apple trees all over America. Yeah. And, knowing what I know about apples now, that's not exactly how that works.
Right.
So,
yes.
But then my significant other the other day dug up some kind of like the true story of Johnny Appleseed kind of thing on BuzzFeed, I'm sure. And they're talking about how Johnny Appleseed was basically this guy who was really into apple cider and was constantly drunk. And
there you go.
He was basically just like your drunken Uncle Joe that nobody wanted to deal with. So he just got shoved from one side of the country to the other, people just basically throwing him out. And I guess wherever he went, he would attempt to set up a cidery.
That's cool.
To make hard cider wherever he went. So he wasn't exactly spreading the apple seed, but he was spreading apples of a variety. I don't know how true that is, though.
Right.
That's the problem with these kind of things. Which is the real Johnny Appleseed, happy-go-lucky guy who liked to plant seeds, or, the drunk who no one wanted to deal with.
There's probably something in between.
Probably.
Have you noticed this, Sarah? There's a whole subgenre of these folk tales that I don't know how to title it, but famous people, usually bad dudes, who you thought you knew they were killed, actually far outlived when you thought they were killed. So, for example, one of the most famous ones is John Wilkes Booth, right? The guy who assassinates Lincoln, and then a few days later, he's found in a barn. They burn the barn down. They shoot him. He's dead. There is a continuing, like a hum out there on the internet that no, the guy who died in the barn was somebody else. He was a fake guy, and that John Wilkes Booth actually lived on for years and years and years under an assumed name. I have recently seen the same thing for, I think it's Jesse James. How, oh no, the guy killed and absolutely was not Jesse James, didn't have the right scars, and that the fact the real Jesse James lived well into the 20th century and changed his name and became like the mayor of a town. And there's always been this story about Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, right? That they really didn't die in that shootout in Brazil, but they returned to America, changed their names, or at least one of them did, and became, upstanding citizens. And I think it's really interesting, this idea that, and of course, Elvis isn't dead, and John Kennedy really wasn't killed, and these folks who somehow managed to attain a level of immortality, even though historians, traditional history says, well, no, we know when they died, we know what killed them, and we know where they're buried. I think I find it interesting, and it's way beyond my field of expertise to think about and wonder about why people want to embrace that notion that these folks who we think we know when they died and how they died, in fact, far outlived what traditional history will tell us.
Well, I mean, the people that you're mulling over there are all the bad guys we love. There's a word for it, and I can't think of it. I'm not a folklorist, but they're a specific archetype of bad guy where they're like sympathetic bad guys.
Well, I mean,
or they've just become such legends that everybody's super excited about them, and of course, if you're hero, they've become heroes, even though they're horrible people.
Right.
But it's that whole, oh, so-and-so, he's so clever, he's so smart, he outwitted everybody and fooled other people into thinking he was dead, when in reality, he wasn't.
Well, that's the thing, too, is that you look at something like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. In most people's minds, well, that's Robert Redford and Paul Newman. Those are nice guys, really good-looking guys, funny, bright, and it's like, well, yeah, so they kind of robbed, but they were nice about it. They didn't really want to kill anybody. And so they were, in a sense, he's kind of the anti-hero. And so this notion that, well, maybe they didn't, at the end of the movie, of course, they're loaded for bear, and they're I think in Brazil, or maybe Mexico, and they're going to run out and fight off. And at the last scene of the movie, they're not dead yet. I mean, it looks like they're going to get killed, but they're not dead yet. So maybe it's possible that these kind of very kind of adorable criminals, I guess you could call them, that maybe they really live. And, Jesse, and again, I'm pretty sure it was Jesse James, where there is this story that, no, he didn't really die. That again, he's almost an anti-hero. He's not a bad guy. He just...
Well, almost all of the quote-unquote cowboy Western bad guys
Billy the
are...
Kid, James
Yeah, they're all like that. And it's like, if you ever met these people in real life, they are not good people.
They shoot you as soon as they look at you. But again...
Probably, yeah.
But again, yes, in terms of... Especially as a result of movies and television shows, there's a reason why they did what they did, and they were not really horrible people. And wouldn't it be interesting if, in fact, they outlived what traditional history would tell us? But that's a whole subgenre, I think, of these historical myths.
It is, but that revisionism is actually a lot what I want to touch on, because especially you see it in the fringe groups, there's a lot of taking stories or oral traditions, especially the older the better, and reinterpreting them so that they are either open-endedly supportive of whatever theory you're trying to sell, or downright solidly supporting the theory that you're trying to sell. You see this a lot with, I see it a lot with the Bigfoot people. Right. They love to take, especially Native American stories and of of man beasts, or because a lot of Native American mythologies across the country will have anthropomorphized figures in them. Coyote being one, raven being another one. I think there's a bear in a couple. And the reason that I'm bringing these up is important because a lot of people will take those and be like, oh, no, they're not using that as a figure of speech or as an archetype. Those are literally man beasts
Right.
that they're literally talking to, and those man beasts are actually Bigfoot.
Well, yeah, but the deal that's really interesting there, Sarah, the point you bring up is really interesting in that they're really selective. So if they talk about some big hairy guy on two legs, that's actually a story of Bigfoot. But then if ravens can talk and coyotes walk on 2 feet and can talk, are there also bipedal coyotes who speak human language? Are there also large ravens who speak human language, or wolves? So in other words, you can't be so selective. Well, are there not also big paws and big claws? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And about that, another interesting point is that if you look at on the other side of the world in Tibet and Nepal, you look at stories of the abominable snowman. Some of those are very clearly in the same realm as our stories of the boogeyman. In other words,
right.
These are stories told by adults to children about why you should not misbehave because this bad guy is going to come and get you. And so they talk about he's big, he's hairy, he's got hair all over his face, and if you don't brush if you don't brush your teeth, he's going to get you. And more seriously,
it's a long-standing parental tradition of terrifying your children into obedience.
Exactly. But in the case of Tibet, Nepal, it's more like this is why you shouldn't go out by yourself at night because this abominable snowman is going to get you. And actually, it's like, listen, if to protect your child, you have to give him a bullshit story so that he's terrified to go out and do something that's really scary and stupid. Maybe that's not such a terrible idea. But again, you have to know the context and know, these are just scary stories that people have told their children to prevent them from doing something dumb and getting hurt or killed. And it's not, the people telling the stories didn't think these were real. They knew exactly what they were doing when they told the story. But if you don't know the cultural context, you just hear, they tell people that there's a giant hairy man beast. They take it literally when it was never meant to be taken literally.
Well, and you see a lot of this selective literal interpretation and revisionism. I want to say it's with the I can't pronounce it, so I'm not going to. But you see a lot of it, again, with the Asian alien peoples, with the whole fiery chariots and the gods flying, space having a dogfight in the sky, where the flying carpets aren't really flying carpets. They're just man's inability to fully describe an airplane. And so you'll hear Ancient Alien and people say that, what they're really describing is this massive fight that they witnessed in the sky, and the loud noises are really bombs going off, but they were too simplistic to be able to fully describe, a bomb going off. So they made this big flowery story about it. But I, being who I am perfectly capable of retranslating this entire story away from what it's actually saying into what I need it to be saying for me to have evidence of aliens.
And those are almost always extremely selective. So in other words, there's this big long story with lots of details, and they cherry pick those things that they think sound like a flying saucer. The perfect example of that is Ezekiel's wheel, which is from the Old Testament of the Bible. And if you select out pieces of it, it sounds like something fiery and spinning that's flying through the air. But what those usually, when the fringe people tell that story and say, well, that sounds like a spacecraft, they leave out the fact that in the same story, it talks about this thing has 4 heads. And I think one's a horse, and one's a lion, and one's a camel, whatever they are. And so it's like, well, wait a minute, that doesn't sound like a flying saucer. And if you're choosing and picking whatever you want from the story of Ezekiel's wheel, well, that's not science. That doesn't make any sense. Why are you not talking about that? Well, you're not talking about that because it doesn't fulfill the preconceived notion that you bring to this whole issue, thinking, oh, yeah, well, it's got to be a flying saucer. So it's no fair to be selective. You have to choose, you have to take the whole story when you're doing that kind of an analysis, and they don't.
Right. It's the cherry picking is a huge problem. But the other end of that is the other problem with this particular practice is they'll choose things that are like the problem with oral histories and the problem with a lot of mythology is if it is written down thousands of years after the fact, after they've been passed down from generation to generation. And though studies have shown that oral histories can change very little, they do change. And they really change when you go from an oral history to a written history. And that's where a lot of the interpretation happens. A really good example of this is when the Norse mythology was written down. It was Snorri Sutherland, I think his name was. Anyway, when he wrote it down, he Christianized a lot of the stories. So he's still telling tales about the gods, but he's reimagining them and reinterpreting them into a Christian mindset. And so things were lost. A lot of stuff was lost in translation. So if you were to pick up the Poetic Eddas and try to translate them and try to take them literally, it would be incorrect to do because they are no longer the stories that were being passed down. And you're also not taking into consideration regional differences. Right. This is a known problem with the Old Testament specifically. We know that there was like a northern group and a southern group, and when they got together to write the stories that made it into the Old Testament, there was a lot of compromise made between the North's version of the story and the South's version of the story.
And then that's when Lilith, who was the first woman before Eve, she gets kind of kicked out because she was uppity and kind of... Lilith was like the first feminist. And I guess some of the folks writing the Bible said, we don't like that story. We don't want Lilith. We don't want the first woman to be an equal to man. We want her to be the helpmate. We want her to be taken from a rib, so she will be like secondary to him. And so there was, you're right, there was all this kind of compromise.
Well, the serpent and the serpent's also another one of those things. One of the things that I've been told is that the serpent was a leftover image of a prior god who was actually considered a helpful god, which is why he was offering the fruit of the tree of knowledge to the two humans. It was kind of one of those, I'm here to set you free kind of things. And once the story got hammered out, that serpent then becomes Satan, and the Satan's tempting the people with the tree of knowledge, which is like the one thing you can't eat. And of course, that's the one thing they want to eat.
And listen, I don't want to get anybody really mad at me, but
too late.
But bottom line here is it's a pretty fucked up story.
Well, the story itself is messed up.
Think about it. That the most horrible thing that Adam and Eve want is they want knowledge. And this is a story about how that's a bad thing. God damn it. You don't want knowledge.
Literally.
You want to be ignorant. And then when they say, hey, you know what? We're going to eat from this tree because it's a tree, it's the fruit of the tree of knowledge, that's a bad thing? What kind of a lesson is that? So we should all be ignorant because that's how God wants us to be. Now, I'm sure there are religious people who would say, no, Fader, you got it all wrong. But when I read that, I read it as pretty messed up that that the lesson there is you're going to get screwed if you eat the fruit from the tree of knowledge. When, my God, I'm a college professor. I'm part of that industry. So I know. Another thing about that too is your discussion of the Norse reminded me of this. Is that in one of my classes when we talk about creation stories, and I ask every kid in the class to go online, find a creation story from a non-Western culture, and then briefly describe it and ask a bunch of questions about it. And every once in a while, I'll get a kid who says, "Well, I did a Native American culture," and then they talk about us, and then they present a story that, oh my God, sounds just like the story in the Old Testament. And there is a couple, and there's an evil snake, and there's a great flood.
Yeah.
And what I do is I ask those kids to go back and where's the source of that story? Where did that story come from? And almost always there's a connection between the original telling of that story as it was collected by missionaries.
Exactly.
And that's when I say, well, you really have to think that. Now, I'm not a folklorist, but my impression about that is that more than likely missionaries talking to Native Americans who they wanted to convert, that was their job, who when Native Americans told stories about, for example, a flood, and lots of people who live along river valleys experience floods, and sometimes they're enormous, and it's not surprising that those flood stories or volcano stories or earthquake stories or tornado stories get incorporated into their oral tradition, their mythology, so that I think that missionaries would hear a native say, well, in our story is that long ago there was this huge flood, and they go, yes, that's exactly what we're talking about. And then the missionaries fill in the blanks about a great boat and everybody saved on board the ark, the two of every kind is on board the ark. And so it's called syncretism, where a native culture incorporates this new information that's being brought to them by these interesting strangers from far away. And so if you don't know that that's happening, you just hear their stories and you go, wow, there must have been a universal flood because these Indians talk about it too.
Well, that's interesting that you bring that up because when we were talking about the Back Creek Stone, that's the one with the Hebrew writing on it, there's actually a group of modern Native Americans who believe that they are descendant from the lost tribes of Israel because they have altered their cultural oral histories to match these fake artifacts that have been sold to them as being authentic. Right. And so they believe that they are the descendants of the lost tribes of Israel.
It's incredibly sad because in my interpretation, what's happening there is that Native people who have an amazing and important, significant culture their perception is that in order for anybody to accept their culture, they have to somehow glom it onto some Western tradition. And that's just, it's really sad. But the whole notion that the American Indians are somehow connected to the lost tribes of Israel as an ongoing myth, legend that at least dates back to the 1700s and probably earlier than that.
Yeah, and it's part of this selective revisionism. It's an ongoing struggle that a lot of Native American cultures have when faced with particularly Christian religion here in the States, right. Because a lot of, I guess, more archaic forms of Christianity really need the Native Americans to not be not connected to the Bible somehow, because that completely wrecks their worldview.
Well, if you go back far enough, you've got folks after it became clear to people in the old world that there was an entire population of people living on two continents that they didn't know existed in the first place. It became really important to explain, who are those people? How the hell did they get there? And some folks had figured out, Noah had 3 sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. And the interpretation before they figured out that there was this entire population of people in the New World, some scholars had it figured out. Well, there are 3 races. There's the Europeans, the Africans, and the Asians. There are 3 sons of Noah. Therefore, each one of those sons of Noah becomes the descendant, the founding father of each of the 3 races. The problem then arose when Native Americans were discovered. That's scare quotes.
Right.
Well, who the hell are they? And there's no 4th son. They seem to be are they a different race? Well, they can't be. How did they get there? We know that after the floodwaters subsided, each of the sons went off in a different direction and founded the three different races. So how did these guys who are across two oceans, how did they get there? Who are they? Because they have to be descendants of Noah. Adam and Eve ultimately, but through Noah and Noah's three sons. And that's when you start getting all this speculation about how did they get to the, who are they? Are they Israelites? Who went up? Are they Romans? Are they Egyptians? They had to be some already existing historical group who arose after the end of the flood, but obviously before Columbus got there.
Well, and we've talked about this with the mound builders.
Sure. Oh, yeah.
That whole, who built the mounds? It couldn't possibly have been the Native Americans because that wouldn't make sense. And so that there was that whole mound builder myth for a long time, which actually the debunking thereof kind of was the creation of the Smithsonian as we know it.
It
so
had a major role in that, right?
Yeah.
And we're not exaggerating here either. I mean, you can go through and find well-known scholars, historians who basically said anybody who thinks that lazy Indians could have done the work to build the mounds, that you're crazy. I mean, there literally was a guy who said you might as well say people from the moon built the mounds because that's just as likely as Indians having done it. And these are
funny story about that.
These are there you go. But these are well-known scholars who absolutely denied any remote possibility that the Indians, who are nomadic and couldn't work together and not particularly smart, could have built the mound. So that kind of racist interpretation was rife. And it really wasn't until it was archaeologists who went out looking, and people like Thomas Jefferson, but certainly Cyrus Thomas of the Smithsonian, who went out there and said, guys, there's plenty of historical evidence and archaeological evidence. These things were built by the descendants of the Native Americans who inhabit the continent today. And that was a long time coming. And you know what? The sad thing is you have people today denying that, saying, "Oh no, it wasn't.
Oh, they're Celts."
The one of the groups in the Mormon Bible.
Yeah,
that's a story for another day. But yes, absolutely.
There's so much to go over there. Well, let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we will kind of give our final thoughts on this very important topic.
The Archaeology and Ale podcast presents a monthly series of lectures on all aspects of archaeology. These lectures are part of the Archaeology in the City program, hosted by the University of Sheffield in England, and are held at the Red Deer pub near the end of the month. The podcast can be heard a few days later. Check out the Red Deer if you're in the area, or find this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, and at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Now let's get back to the show.
And we are back, and we are still discussing oral histories, folklore, and mythology. Ken, what are your final thoughts? I know you were trying to touch on something earlier before we jumped ahead.
I think that ultimately, here's a great example, I think, of the valid use of oral histories in archaeology.
Yes.
And again, I'm going to keep harping on my 50 sites. One of the sites that I visited...
Ken, do you have a book?
Not yet, but it's coming. In northern New Mexico, there's a place called Crow Canyon. It's not the Crow Canyon in Colorado, where there's an archaeological institute. It's called Crow Canyon because that's what it's called. And the Navajo consider this place. They call this place Dinite, which is their place of origin. It is their oral tradition that they didn't come from anywhere else, that they came up from out of the ground in this place called Dinite and spread from there. In this Crow Canyon, there's a lot of really cool rock art. And it's rock art, some of it is only a few hundred years old because it literally, some of it's older, but some of it is literally the historical petroglyphs produced by by members of the Navajo tribe in the 1500s and even 1600s. And when archaeologists look at those images, they talk to modern Navajo and ask them, who are these guys? What is their significance? What is their meaning? What are the meanings of these images? And it's the Navajo who say, okay, that's a corn plant, and that's the corn plant growing out of a thundercloud, and that is a god, that's an important god, and what he's got on his back is a powerful medicine bag. And so that's a wonderful example of archaeologists who want to understand the antiquity of the American Southwest, who are asking the native people who have direct personal knowledge about these images, asking them, what does this mean to you? Now, that doesn't mean that we don't then go about the process of seeing scientifically, looking at these things statistically, how do they change through time? What are the tools used to produce these things? What are the contexts and associations of different images on different kinds of walls? That's all valid too, but nevertheless, it's this combination of looking at it both from the perspective of an outsider, but also getting the perspective of insiders, their oral history, their oral tradition. That's a really nice piece of work. I have no sympathy and no patience whatsoever for somebody who is not Navajo, who waltzes into Crow Canyon and says, "Well, that looks like a guy with an air, with a scuba thing on his back, so he's an extraterrestrial alien." That is nonsense, and it's not particularly useful.
I feel like when it comes to this kind of thing, I feel like there's almost two types of archaeology that's being done. There's the archaeology where we're recovering oral history and we're preserving oral history and mythology. And then there's the part of it where we're looking at what's in front of us scientifically. And, if the two things don't meet up, that's not necessarily bad. Actually, I don't feel like it's bad at all, because the definitions and the interpretations of the people attached to the images and the history, how that translates for them is just as important as the scientific fact that we're finding there, because the really interesting part happens in the overlap.
Sure, absolutely. And you know what? We're not always going to agree. And I mentioned Vindaloria before. And that is, if you're in a situation where if a Navajo were to tell me that, no, they were always in New Mexico, Arizona, if in fact their ancestors came up out of the ground in this place, all right, that's your religious belief, that's your ideology. The archaeology, that is the physical evidence and the linguistic evidence, shows, well, no, the ancestors of the modern Navajo came from the north and they speak a different language, and the physical material evidence indicates that they were not indigenous to the Four Corners region, that they moved into this region and encountered the ancestors of the modern Hopi. And we can agree to disagree, but the direction you take, whichever direction you take, understand that both of those pieces of information, that is the local interpretation, the native interpretation, and the scientific interpretation, are interesting and worthy of consideration and study.
I mean, I don't feel like there has to be an argument. I don't feel like it has to be an either or, because they are both important, because the history of the people as the people see it is just as important as knowing from where the people who became the Navajo came from.
Sure.
And knowing what other sister groups they have out there. And I mean, knowing the family tree of the groups that become the Navajo. That's important to us as researchers. It's important that we know these things, and it's important that we can categorize and classify and identify these things when they pop up in other areas, because that information means a lot to us as researchers. But it's just as important to us in the other aspect of archaeology, which is preservation. It's just as important to be able to have the oral histories and the people's interpretations readily available and kept for when a lot of languages, a lot of Native American languages are dying, and archaeologists are working very hard to preserve those languages. Those languages are very wrapped up in oral tradition and oral history and mythology. And we lose those things if we don't maintain the oral histories as equally valid and important as the scientific data that we're going to get.
Yeah, the oral traditions of what the art in Crow Canyon means is absolutely vital, and it's significant, and it's important, and should not be denigrated or ignored. It's a part of the whole story, and that's important. But again, always remember that doesn't mean that somebody else gets to walk in there and make up a story about spacemen or Bigfoot or whatever else.
And it also doesn't mean that we're going to view Crow Canyon as an isolated incident.
Right. Oh, yeah.
I mean, we're viewing Crow Canyon and its interpretations in the light of the people who are descendant from the people who created it. But we're also looking at it as researchers and saying, okay, we've got Crow Canyon here, and we've got this other location way over here, and there's a lot of similarities between these different, images that are being used and the stories that are being told. Maybe there's a connection, and we'll go investigate that. We're not going to view them both as completely isolated and completely unrelated.
And for anybody listening to this podcast, Crow Canyon is land that's maintained by the Bureau of Land Management. It's open to the public, and there are some really very easy and hikes through some amazing landscapes, and you'll see some very, very interesting rock art.
So you should go there.
Oh, you absolutely should go there. Yep.
So is that your final thought?
That's my final thought. Go visit Crow Canyon
right.
and see it for yourself.
Go visit Crow Canyon. Final thought.
But
I'm
if
agreed.
you're going to do that, wait until my book is out, buy a copy of the book, and take it with you.
And take it with you.
Of course.
And take pictures of yourself and your book next to the rock art in Crow Canyon, and then send those pictures to Ken.
I'm actually hoping putting together a WordPress site so that once the book is out, I really do want people to go to these places and send me pictures and tell me about their reactions, and also to maybe say, hey, you know what, Fader? You have 50 cool sites, but here's one that I went to that's not in your book that it should go in your book when you expand it to 75 sites. And I appreciate that as well.
Okay, well, Ken, thank you very much.
Absolutely. Great fun.
Always good. Thank you.
See you
Talk to you later.
Yeah, you betcha.
Rate your trials as one will call. No, we don't do a dinosaur.
Thanks for listening. We hope you've enjoyed it. Our music was provided by Archaeosuit Productions. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Stitcher, and share us wherever you use social media. You can contact us with your questions, comments, or angry email at archifantasies@gmail.com. You can follow the podcast at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archifantasies. You can follow the blog at www.archifantasies.com and get updates on Tumblr and Twitter at Archifantasies. You can also look for us on Facebook. If you're looking for the show notes for this episode, go to the podcast website at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archifantasies. Thanks again for listening.
No, we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs. We don't do dinosaurs.
This show is produced by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle, and was edited by Chris Webster.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.